Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to this latest reading of Walter Rodney's "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa." We'll be doing chapter 4 today, section 4.3 is where we'll be starting. So, thank you for being here on the live reading. If you are here on the live reading, as always, you can find the PDF in the pinned section, and if you're following along on the YouTube, you can find the PDF in the description as always. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Zoe, and we'll get started with this latest reading of Walter Rodney's "How Europe Underdeveloped Africa."
All right, so we are picking back up at section 4.3, continuing politico-military developments in Africa, 1500 to 1885. And everyone can hear me okay, right? Audio quality is good and everything?
Audio quality is great.
All right, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, I guess. So, modern African nationalist historians correctly stress that Africa has a meaningful past long before the coming of Europeans. They also stress that Africans made their own history long after coming into contact with Europe, and indeed right up to the period of colonization. That African-centered approach to the continent's past is quite compatible with one which equally emphasizes the transformatory role of external forces, such as overseas trade in slaves, gold, ivory, etc. Sorry, one second. The reconciliation of the two approaches is facilitated by bearing in mind the following three factors. A. The external and mainly European impact up to 1885 was very uneven in geographical terms, with the coasts being obviously more exposed. B. Commerce with Europeans affected different aspects of African life in varying degrees, with the political, military, and ideological apparatus being virtually untouched. C. Dynamic features of independent African evolution and development, as illustrated in Chapter 2, continued to operate after 1500. It has already been argued that it would be misleading to try and compartmentalize Africa into areas that were affected by slave trading and those that were not, for the continent as a whole had to bear the cost. However, for present purposes, it is enough to make the crude distinction between those parts of Africa which were directly caught up in European-generated activities, and those parts which to all appearances continued in the traditional manner. Developments continued in certain areas such as South-Central Africa, because the population there was free to pursue a path dictated by the interplay between African people and the African environment in those particular localities. Besides, there were achievements even in those societies under the heaviest bombardment of slaving. Slave trade led to the commercial domination of Africa by Europe within the context of international trade. In very few instances did Europeans manage to displace African political authorities in the various social systems. So African states in close contact with Europe in the pre-colonial era nevertheless had scope for political maneuver, and their evolution could and did continue. Military conquest of Africa awaited the years of the imperialist scramble. In pre-colonial centuries of contact with Europe, African armies were in existence, with all the socio-political implications which attach to an armed sector in society. Equally important was the fact that direct imports from Europe in the cultural and ideological spheres were virtually nil. Christianity tried sporadically and ambivalently to make an impact on some parts of the continent. But most of the few missionaries in places like the Congo, Angola, and Upper Guinea concentrated on blessing Africans as they were about to be launched across the Atlantic into slavery. As it was, Christianity continued only in Ethiopia, where it had indigenous roots. Elsewhere, there flourished Islam and other religions which had nothing to do with European trade. As before, religion continued to act as an element of the superstructure, which was crucial in the development of the state. So long as there is political power, so long as people can be mobilized to use weapons, and so long as society has the opportunity to define its own ideology, culture, etc., then the people of that society have some control over their own destinies, in spite of constraints such as those imposed as the African continent slipped into orbit as a satellite of capitalist Europe. After all, although historical development is inseparable from material conditions and the state of technology, it is also partially controlled by a people's consciousness at various stages. That is part of the interdependence of base and superstructure alluded to at the outset. Revolution is the most dramatic appearance of a conscious people or class on the stage of history. But, to a greater or lesser extent, the ruling class in any society is always engaged in the developmental process as conscious instruments of change or conservatism. Attention in this section will be focused on the political sphere and its power companion, the military. In those areas, Africans were able to excel even in the face of slave trading. Politico-military development in Africa from 1500 to 1885 meant that African social collectives had become more capable of defending the interests of their members, as opposed to the interests of people outside the given community. It also meant that the individual in a politically mature and militarily strong state would be free from external threat of physical removal. He would have more opportunities to apply his own skill in fields as diversified as minstrelry and bronze working, under the protection of the state. He could also use his creativity and inventiveness to refine the religion of his people, or to work out a more manageable constitution, or to contribute to new techniques of war, or to advance agriculture and trade. Of course, it is also true that the benefits of all such contributions went mainly to a small section of African society, both within and without the zone of slaving, for as communalism receded, the principle of egalitarian distribution was disregarded. These various points can be illustrated by concrete historical examples drawn from all over the continent during the pre-colonial period in question. All right, so let's pause there briefly for discussion. So, anyone got anything they want to say so far about the chapter?
Okay, so one of the things that was like interesting in this first part is when he was talking about. So he says it has already been argued that it would be misleading to try and compartmentalize Africa into areas that were affected by slave trading and those which were not. For the continent as a whole had to bear the cost. However, for present purposes, it is enough to make the cruel distinction between those parts of Africa which were directly caught up in European-generated activities and those parts which, to all appearances, continue in a traditional manner. So, like the part that was really interesting in that is he's making this really poignant point about the fact that there isn't there isn't a part of Africa that wasn't impacted by the colonial interaction with the continent, whether it had been directly stolen from, or whether it had just felt the brunt of Europeans having been there in the first place. So that's not a point that comes up. There's often this idea that the colonizing imperialists kind of looted the whole land and took slaves from uh, or took people as slaves rather from every part of the continent. But that's not necessarily the case. But it's still the case that, as he'll go into later, that every part of Africa was affected. So that's a good thing for him to bring up. Another thing he says is, let's see, developments continue in certain areas such as Central Africa because the population there was free to pursue a path dictated by the interplay between African people and the African environment and their particular localities. Besides, there were achievements even in those societies under the heaviest bombardments of slavery. Slave trading led to the commercial domination of Africa of Europe by Europe within the context of international trade. In very few instances did Europeans manage to displace African political authorities in the various social systems, so African states in close contact with Europe in the pre-colonial era nevertheless had scope for political maneuver, and their evolution could and did continue. So oftentimes you'll hear this idea espoused by people who haven't engaged with like any Africans talking about what's happening in Africa. This idea that like the colonizers managed to get their like foothold all over the continent and like put like imperial sympathizers in like every part of the continent to like help do their bidding, but that like necessarily wasn't the case as he's talking about here. He's saying like for the most part they weren't displacing what political authorities already existed. Uh, Not to say that they never managed to displace any political authorities or kill anybody with any kind of political power. Of course, that wasn't the case, but it was still the case that they managed to most more or less keep uh, their people and culture in places throughout most of the continent, and like that necessarily is going to play a role in how development gets facilitated later. So that's another good point that he brought up. So those are just the two main things that jumped out from this first part of what you read.
Yeah, even worse though, you'll also see this idea that the people of Africa were this totally passive object of European, policy and exploitation.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And yeah,
There's I mean, it goes without saying that that was bullshit. You know, the colonizers didn't just show up and then Africans were like, oh, well, they seem to have superior technology. Guess that's it. Gonna fold and give them Africa and give them the whole continent. Like, no, there was pretty violent resistance. Hell, there's still pretty violent resistance today. Like nobody ends up getting crushed harder than any given African country. Whenever any African country is successful, and like what's the word I'm looking for? Just resisting. I can't remember the name of the. Was it the? It was there was a movie that depicted a real life event. That's name slipping me. That's name is slipping me. I think. Is it Black Hawk Down?
Battle of Algiers, or
Yeah, I might be thinking about Black Hawk Down, possibly. The one where it might be Battle of Algiers too, but is it Black Hawk Down where
Black
the
Hawk Down is the Battle of Mogadishu, which was in the 1990s.
yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. Like,
Okay.
just this idea that like today, the way she gets imperial policy imposed on her is like a direct result of like the embarrassment of like past successful African resistance, because from their perspective, how dare Africans show any audacity to fight back and like push out colonizers. You can see uh, policy, you can see sanctions get ramped up today, and like even the language that they use toward Africa and how they like talk about her, and like even the way they talk about Black Hawk Down, because like when you watch the movie, it's totally coming from this perspective of like,
Yeah.
they were wrong to fight back in the first place, as if
Yeah.
like, what, you're coming into their country? What the fuck are you talking about? So.
Yeah, the moment they, defy the disgusting settler archetype of, the helpless childlike savage, and then they, just get horrifically repressed.
Exactly. And then end up getting propagandized and with this idea that like, they're not peaceful, and like that's why we end up like doing this violence, because like we have to bring like peace to the region. But like, I don't know, how can there be, you always end up finding peaceful people who fight back and then like complaining about the fact that there's no peace. Well, you bought instability to the region. The instability wasn't there until the logic of colonialism like reared its ugly head. That's never part of the narrative. So yeah, that was the one I was thinking of. The Battle of Mogadishu was like one of the more recent grotesque examples of like colonial embarrassment in the past, having led to uh, imperial policy and more repression and in a shift in how they do their propaganda today. I mean, even now that impacts how even foreign policy gets done, because now they just kind of don't assume that everything's just going to be peachy and they're just going to be able to march in and do whatever they want, and they hate the idea that like Africans set a precedent. They're like, no, there's going to be violent pushback. You're not just going to be able to like waltz right on in and succeed at whatever your objective seems to be. So yeah, that's like a pretty strong takeaway that I had from this first this opening salvo, so to speak, of 4.3. We might only finish 4.3 today if we finish it at all. We might. Why don't we just go to?
Hang on a sec. Let me double check how long that section is.
Why don't we just go through?
Yeah, so it's chapter 4.3 is like about 60 pages, so we're not going to finish it all today.
Not at all. Why don't we just get through like the Hami, which is like section B, and then we'll continue week from there. Yeah.
All right, sounds good.
All right.
So, Lecton, did you want to read, or should I go on? All right, I will continue with section A, the Yoruba. In a previous discussion, the Yoruba state of Oyo was merely listed as one of the outstanding representatives of African development up to the eve of European arrival in the 15th century. The remarkable 14th and 15th century artistic achievements of the Oyo, God, I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, of its parent state of life, and of the related state of Benin have been well studied because of the preservation of ivory, terracotta, and bronze sculptures. It is clear that the earliest bronzes were the best and that there was a deterioration in execution and sensitivity from the 16th through to the 18th century. However, politically, states such as Oyo and Benin did continue to prosper for a very long time after the arrival of Europeans on the West African coast. Since Oyo and the Yoruba people were within an intensive area of slave trading, their fate between 1500 and 1885 is of considerable significance. The Kingdom of Oyo kept fairly clear of any involvement with slave trading until the late 18th century. Sorry, got a little bit of echo. Instead, its people concentrated on local production and trade, and on the consolidation and expansion of the trade. Indeed, although the nucleus of the Oyo kingdom had already been established in the 15th century, it was during the next 3 centuries that it expanded to take control of most of what was later termed Western Nigeria, large zones north of the river Niger, and the whole of what is now Dahomey. In effect, it was an empire ruled over by an Alafin in conjunction with an aristocracy. It was in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that the subtle constitutional mechanisms which regulated relations between the Alafin and his principal subjects and between the capital and provinces were crystallized. Insofar as Oyo had an interest in the coast, it was an outlet more for cloth than for slaves. Being some distance inland, the Yoruba of Oyo concentrated on relations with the hinterland, thereby connecting with the Western Sudanic trading zone. It was from the north that the Oyo got the horses which made its armies feared and respected. Oyo is a prime example of that African development which had its roots deep in the past, in the contradictions between man and environment. Its people continued to develop on the basis of forces which they did not consciously manipulate, as well as through the deliberate utilization of political techniques. Early in the 19th century, Oyo and Yoruba land in general began to export captives in considerable numbers. They were obtained partly by military campaigns outside Yoruba land, but also through local slave procuring. Local slave procuring involved kidnapping, armed raids, uncertainty, and disunity. Those features, together with internal constitutional tensions and an external threat from the Islamic North, brought about the downfall of the Oyo Empire by about 1830. The famous Yoruba ancestral home of Ife was also despoiled and its citizens turned into refugees because of quarrels among the Yoruba over kidnapping for sale into slavery.
But it was testimony to the level of development in the part of New Africa that within a few years the inhabitants were able to reconstruct new political states, notably those of New Oyo, Ibadan, Ejaye, Abeokuta, and Ejibo, each centered on a town and with enough land for successful agriculture. Until the British arrived to kindly impose order in Nigeria, the Yoruba people kept experimenting with various political forms with heavy emphasis on the military and keeping to the religion of their forefathers. Yeah, so being conscious of territorial boundaries, the inhabitants and rulers of any given state invariably being conscious of territorial boundaries, the inhabitants and rulers of any given state invariably become involved in clashes with neighboring states. The state in the feudal epoch in Europe and Asia was particularly concerned with its military capacity. The ruling class comprised its in whole or in part the professional fighting forces of the state. One rationalization by which they justified their enjoyment of the major portion of the surplus of society was that they offered armed protection to the ordinary peasant or serf. This generalization was as true of 19th century Yoruba land as it was of Prussia and Japan. Without a doubt, Africans in that region were proceeding along the line of development leading to social organization comparable to feudalism in Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa, such as Ethiopia and the Maghreb, which were at the stage some centuries earlier. In the Oyo Empire, the civil power was dominant and the military generals were servants of the king. Subsequently, however, the military took over effective political power. For instance, the Ajaye state was founded by Nkrumah, said to have been the greatest Yoruba general of those troubled times following the fall of Oyo. Nkrumah established a personal military ascendancy in Ajaye. Ibadan was slightly different in that there was a group of military officers who collectively formed the political elite. Efforts to put civilians back in power were half-hearted and unsuccessful. After all, the town itself grew out of a military encampment. The city-state of Abeokuta perhaps made the most consistent effort to make the military an arm of the civil state. But what mattered most was the defense of the townships within the fortified walls of Abeokuta. Abeokuta's fortified walls became famous as the place where many of the rival army met disaster. And under those circumstances, the Ulagan or war chiefs were the social and political powers. While the militarization politics was going on in Yoruba land, changes were taking place in the structure of the society, which brought about sharper class stratification. Numerous captives were taken in war, most of whom were sold to Europeans, so that Yoruba land became notorious as a slave-supplying region right up to the 1860s. But many war prisoners were retained locally in conditions approximating either to slavery or to serfdom, depending on whether or not they were first-generation captives. Sometimes refugees fleeing from destroyed towns also had no option other than to become clients or serfs of other free Yoruba. Such refugees were made to give service to their new overlords. by farming the land in return for armed protections. However, serfs were also used as soldiers, which means that they had access to the means of production, the land, only through meeting an obligation in military labor. That is a measure of the extent to which the principle of kinship had been weakened, and it indicates that, in contrast to the typical communal village, states such as those in 19th century Yoruba land allocated roles and rewards to their citizens on the basis of reciprocal obligations characteristic of feudalism. During the period under discussion, the division of labor among the Yoruba was extended with the rise of professional soldiers, or war boys, as they were called. The professional soldiers, who were sons of aristocrats, left farming disdainfully to prisoners and serfs, the large numbers of whom ensured agricultural plenty. Other branches of economic activity also flourished, notably the making of cloth and palm oil and the trade in various products. These things were true in spite of the fact that by the time some labor was being lost both in the form of slaves exported and in the form of labor power devoted to capturing people for export. European visitors to Yoruba land in the middle of the 19th century could still admire the level of its material culture, along with the highly colorful and impressive aspects of its non-material culture, such as the annual yam festivals and the ritual of the religious cults of Shingo, Ogboni, and etc. Let's see. One item of European technology that was anxiously sought by Africans and that was fairly easily attainable from Europeans was the firearm. From the 1820s onwards, the Yoruba acquired European firearms in large numbers and integrated them into the pattern of trade, politics, and military strategy. On the eve of colonial rule, Yoruba generals were reaching out for breech-loading rifles and even rockets, but Europe stepped in too quickly for that move to get very far. Through a series of actions which started as early as 1860s in Lagos, and which included missionary infiltration as well as armed invasion, the British managed to bring that part of Africa under colonial rule. Economic development in a matter of an increasing capacity to produce, as it is tied up with patterns of land tenure and class relations. These basic facts were well brought out both positively and negatively in Yoruba history in the decades before independence was lost. So long as agricultural production was not disrupted, then for so long any given Yoruba state remained in a strong position. Ibadan was once the greatest military power in Yoruba land, selling captives as well as retaining many for use as laborers for its own benefit. But Ibadan's farming areas were hit by war, and Ibadan's rulers also started removing prisoners farming the land and selling them instead to Europeans. That became necessary because Ibadan needed farmers, and those could only be attained by selling slaves. It was at that point that the undermining effect of the presence of European slave buyers on that coast became really permanent, or paramount. By selling its own captives and serfs, Ibadan was undermining its own socio-economic basis. If the prisoners were to develop into a true serf class, then those prisoners would have to be guaranteed the right to remain fixed on the soil and protect it from sale. That was one of the reasons why slavery was, as a mode of production in Europe, had to give way to serfdom and feudalism. And under normal circumstances, Yoruba society did rapidly guarantee the irremovability of those captives who were integrated into the local production pattern. But forces unleashed by the European presence as slave buyers were too great to be withstood, and any hope of solving the problem disappeared with the loss of political power under colonialism. Too often, historians lay undue emphasis on the failure of 19th century Yoruba states to unite and produce an entity as large as the former Empire of Oyo. But firstly, the size of political unit is not the most important criterion for evaluating the achievement of its peoples. And secondly, a given people can disintegrate politically and later integrate even more effectively. The Yoruba states of Ibadan, Abeokuta, Ajayi, etc., had populations of up to 100,000 citizens, as large as most of the city-states, principalities, and palatinates of feudal Germany. That is a comparison which is worth bringing to light, as it is one that struck European observers who happened to visit Yoruba land in the middle of the 19th century. Germany had long had a common culture and language, and there was a form of political unity under the Holy Roman Empire from the 12th to the 15th century. However, after the Reformation and the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, the German people were divided into as many separate political entities as there are days in a year, some of them being hardly bigger than a public park. Yet, and the internal class relations and productive forces continued to develop throughout Germany. And ultimately, by 1870, unity was again achieved, with feudalism giving way to a powerful capitalist nation state. Similarly, the Yoruba were a widely spread cultural entity with a single language. After the fall of the Oyo Empire, the development processes were slowed down by both internal and external factors, but they were not stopped. It took the arrival of the European colonialism to do that. Without the spear of West and Central African slavery, state building continued with varying degrees of success. For instance, the Akan state system grew up in a manner as oppressive as that of the Oyo Empire. Fortunately for the Akan, slave exports reached alarming proportions only during the first half of the 18th century. By that time, a state such as Asante had sunk roots deep enough to withstand the adverse effects of slaving. It continued to be incorporated with the heartlands of the Western Sudan. And by the 1870s, when the British tried to dictate to Asante, these famous African people did not give up without heroic armed struggle. Asante's connection with the export of slaves in the 18th century led its rulers to concentrate on expansionism of the people, which would bring in captives through wars, raids, tribute, and as articles of trade from regions where they had been made prisoner. Besides, since the 15th century, a Khan country was building up rather than exporting its human resources. Captives were incorporated locally into the society, and on the eve of colonialism, a substantial proportion of Asante society was made up of Andankoba, the descendants of one-time captives, who were the laboring population on the land. Development had come not through exporting and losing labor, but by increasing and maximizing it. So, let's pause for discussion a little bit, y'all. So, it's really interesting when he's talking about the what the priorities were in terms of like trade and like facilitating development and everything like that was. He's talking about the he says, so Electra says, much of the Africans that were taken here to Jamaica were from the Akan. I say, hell yeah, Electra. So one of the things that's like interesting, he's bringing up like the importance of, or not the importance rather, but like how one of the things that they were ready to trade or sell to Africans was guns. But when you think about what Nkrumah was saying and how and neo-colonialism, that actually ends up having a more sinister character to it, because when he's talking about them selling guns in neo-colonialism, he's also like emphasizing how they refused to like teach how to produce the guns themselves, how to facilitate development and manufacturing themselves. And then he's also talking about how they like necessarily like force Africa to like reshape her economy around resources that like Africa not maybe hadn't traditionally chose to shape the economy around, particularly ivory. So they're selling guns, they're doing it en masse, and they're doing it at like these disproportionate rates. And then you can see necessarily how the logic of colonialism plays out, right? Because they got these guns now that they were sold by the Europeans, and now the Europeans themselves are going to use that as a pretext to say, well, they're armed. They're not just harmless savages. These are armed savages. And we like need to necessarily defend ourselves. In the interest, promoting growth and prosperity and democracy and freedom. So like when you combine like the logic that Nkrumah is putting out with like the logic that like Rodney is putting out, you start to get like a picture of like exactly what it is these fucking settlers are trying to do in terms of like creating this like unfalsifiable orthodoxy that they can then use as like a further pretext to do more colonialism. They're not interested in like facilitating a healthy, non-coercive relationship with Africa at all. Of course not. So that's one thing that came away from this? What else was an important thing to mention? He's often talking about the resistance and like how the Yoruba are fighting back. He's talking about the strength of the military and how the cities uh, were often compared to like some of the like medium-sized German cities. Uh, he's talking about they're as large as some of the city-states, principalities, and palatinates of feudal Germany. So they're relatively large. Uh, and this gives you like a fucking idea of like the kind of places we're talking about. We're not, it's not these like racist depictions of like, or it's not only these like racist depictions of like, small villages of like 100 people that they're going to subjugate. Like, no, they're going in and they're subjugating, places of hundreds of thousands of folks, and because Rodney may be underselling how populations, how big some of these populations were even. For fuck's sake, how could they have even been in any effective way back then, even been keeping count? So if it says 100,000, it could have possibly meant more than that. So that's another thing to bring up. Another thing is he's talking about the resistance to slavery, where they're like, to the best extent possible, because like Europeans love to like push this. They sold their own into slavery. We just like were opportunistic about it, and that was fucked up. But like they sold their own into slavery, so like both sides are bad, kind of thing. They like try to like use that to like duck any kind of responsibility for like what their ancestors did. But the thing about that is like Rodney shitting on that idea, being like, yeah, they tried to facilitate making like as many natives unable to be sold because of their relationship to production as possible. If you were a laborer, they tried to, especially in the Yoruba, they tried to make it so that you couldn't, you weren't up for grabs. You couldn't be sold. But as we know, these, and as he says later, this could not go on forever because they could not successfully fight back the influence of European expansionism and colonialism, and even those who were labeled as unbuyable, so to speak, or eventually subject to being kidnapped and taken from their home and tied up in chains and enslaved. Uh, Zoe says, plus guns were important tools for the maintenance of these warped economies, killing elephants, taking prisoners, etc. And Europeans who control access to those guns and replacement parts for them presumably could use that control to directly manipulate those economic structures. Exactly. If you need an African to build something, or you need like to like kill some Africans to like justify like a colonial project, a better way to do it than to be like, hey, that African was armed and all I was doing was defending myself. It's not like we don't see the same goddamn logic playing out today. Pigs use that logic all the time. They said that's how they strong armed Ibadan and the people they wanted to keep for their own labor force. Exactly. That's exactly what he was describing there. So like that's a super important point to bring up. Yeah, we can continue on. We'll just go to this section, end of the section here, section B, the Hame, and then we'll wrap up for this week because I actually need to go to the hospital soon. So, Asante's eastern neighbor beyond the Volta River was the Home. Since the Home was more deeply involved in the European slave trade for a much longer period, its experiences shall be cited at a greater length. Throughout the 18th to 19th century, the Home had a stagnant, if not declining population, and an economy that had virtually no props other than slave exports. What the Home succeeded in doing, despite of all of that, is a tribute to the achievements of man inside the African continent. It should be made clear that the groundwork for the socio-political development of the Aja or Fan people of Dahomey was laid down in the period preceding the influence of Europe on West Africa. By the 15th century, the Aja states of Alada and Huaida were already in existence, having a loose connection with the Yoruba of life. Dahomey was an offshoot from Alada in the 16th century, and by the early 18th century, it expanded to incorporate both Alada and Huaida. The kings of Alada and Huaida, those are such badass names right away. had made the mistake of either failing to protect their own citizens from enslavement or of actually conniving at their enslavement. Dahomey never followed such a policy, which was directly antagonistic to the very maintenance of the state. Instead, Dahomey eventually became the class-rating state of West Africa after failing to get Europeans to accept any products other than human beings. To achieve that, Dahomey had first to build up a tightly organized military state, whose monarch came much closer to an authoritarian or despot than did the Elephant of Oyo or the Asante Hane of Asante. Asante Hane. Let's see. Secondly, Dahomey invested a great deal of time and ingenuity on its army so as to protect its own citizens and wage war abroad. Within European history, the state of Sparta stood out as one that was completely dedicated to the art of war. Europeans in Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries invariably referred to Dahomey as Black Sparta. Throughout the 18th century, the cavalry of Oyo was more than a match for Dahomey's foot soldiers, and Dahomey remained the tribute-paying portion of the Oyo Empire. But with the fall of Oyo, Dahomey became the supreme military state in that region, and indeed wreaked vengeance on its former Yoruba overlords. Warfare was necessary for securing slaves outside of Dahomey and for obtaining firearms. It was in fact essential for survival. Dahomey's profound Dahomey's profound preoccupation with militaristic activities can be illustrated in many ways. Their value system rewarded the brave and the victorious, while ruthlessly despising and even liquidating the cowardly and the unsuccessful on the battlefield. The two chief ministers of the king were the commanders of the left and right. Armies and other military officers held political appointments. And then, too, the artistic media constantly harped upon the theme of war. Beautiful mosaics and paintings appeared on the walls of the palaces of Dahomey, all dealing with military victories. Historical accounts, as rendered by professional reciters, reflected the same bias, and the cloth workers busied themselves making emblems, colors, and umbrellas for the generals and the regiments. Two unique innovations set Dahomey off from its African neighbors and even gives it a special claim within the context of feudal or semi-feudal military organization. Firstly, Dahomey encouraged young boys to become apprentices of war. By the age of 11 or 12, a boy would be attached to a veteran soldier helping to carry his supplies and observing battle. The second innovation, and the one that was more widely commented upon, was Dahomey's utilization of its female population within the army. Apparently, the wives in the royal palace started off as a ceremonial guide in the 18th century, and then progressed to become an integral part of Dahomey's fighting machine, on terms of complete equality of hardship and reward. Dahomey's population in the 9th century was probably no more than 200,000, and the state consistently managed to send 12,000 to 15,000 actives on its annual campaigns. Of those, it was estimated in 1845 that some 5,000 were women, so-called Amazons of Dahomey, who were feared for their ferocity in battle. There's so much for the docile and meek black woman, huh? It's always been some historical horseshit, judging from what Angela has to teach us in women, race, and class. In the long run, the trade in slaves and cast a blight on Dahomey. Slaving campaigns were costly and not always rewarding in terms of captives. European buyers failed to turn up during certain years, depending on European conditions, e.g., during the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and the subsequent Revolutionary Wars. There was a lull in Dahomey and slave exports because far fewer European ships could be spared for the trade in slaves. Without selling captives to get firearms to carry on more warfare for slaves, Dahomey felt its glory and military honor was slipping. Resort to human sacrifice was an attempt to compensate for the diminishing reputation of the state and its monarch, as was the case with the Oba of Benin in the 19th century. Even so, the story of the reputed savagery of Dahomey was exaggerated incredibly. The Dahomeyan states created such refinements as a population census. It conducted diplomacy far and wide, with all the niceties and the protocol that one usually hears of only in connection with civilized European states. And it built up a system of espionage and intelligence as an essential ingredient in its own security. Uh, Above all, attention should be focused at least briefly on the role of the artist in Dahomeyan society. Mm-hmm. Much of African art springs from elaboration of things functional such as pottery and cloth. However, both religion and the state power also stimulated art. For instance, the brasses and bronzes of life were executed on behalf of the religious cults and were executed with the Oni of life and the royal family. Indeed, it is a most widespread phenomenon that the feudal ruling class gave its protection to artists, along with sustenance and recognition. This was true in Mandarin China, with pottery makers and theater artists. It was true of 16th century Italy of the Renaissance, and it was true of the Dahomeyan from the 17th to the 19th centuries. No one knows which Dahomeyan is to be credited with any given artistic achievement of the independent pre-colonial period. However, in that time, particular individuals were being given the opportunity for self-discovery and self-development and of serving the society as a whole. Their task was to give pleasure and to capture the hopes and ambitions of the people in um, palace wall paintings, in wrought iron sculptures, and the stamped patterns of hand-woven cloths designed for royalty. On the intricately carved heads of the safe conduct staffs of the king's ambassadors, and in the lively tales of how the founder of the Dahomeyan kingdom came out of the belly of a leopard. It was art that centered around royalty and noble families, but it was also a national product and a point of identification for the people as a whole. Subsequently, such artistic skills either disappeared or became debased to serve the curiosity of Philistine colonialists. Uh, it is still held in some quarters that Dahomey's development in certain spheres must be credited to slave trading. To demonstrate conclusively that African political and military development through to the 19th century was an extension of groundwork already laid in an earlier epoch, it is best to turn to zones where foreign influence was non-existent. The interlacustrine zone of East Africa is one such. Yeah. All right. So we got through section 4. Well, not 4.3, but we got through about 3 sections of 4.3. So let's do a little bit of discussion before I need to head out to the hospital. So he's given some pretty descriptive military numbers here, huh? You know, talking about Dahomey's population reaching no more than 200,000 in the 19th century, but managing to muster up 12,000 to 15,000 active duty soldiers. Of those, it's estimated that 5,000 of those were women. So, you know, for the times, that would have been quite progressive. Uh, that's pretty impressive. They're fighting back colonizers. They're uh, stopping people from like being sold into slavery. They're doing exactly what you would expect people who are under colonial occupation or threat of a colonial occupation to do. And, you know, material conditions probably led to some like pretty like brutal realities in terms of what you might have to do in order to resist colonization. And, you know, that's just the logic that colonialism like brings forward to a continent, unfortunately. Uh, he said, I never heard of Black Sparta before either, y'all. I don't know had y'all heard about it. He said in Europe and Africa at the 18th and 19th centuries, Europeans in Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries invariably referred to Dahomey as Black Sparta. So, like, that clearly uh, is some sort of, like, testimony to, like, the ferocity of Dahomeyan soldiers and, like, their not just ferocity, but aptitude for war and for battle. Uh, that's not a light reference, you know, that they'd be given to these Bohemians. Throughout the 19th century, he says the cavalry of Oyo was more than a match for Dahome's foot soldier, and Dahomey remained a tribute-paying portion of the Oyo Empire. Um, But he says with the fall of the Oyo Empire, they became the supreme military state. So now you got like this really ferocious force that is also the supreme military state or military power in the region. I kind of wonder what like consequences that invariably leads to. Maybe Rodney will teach us more about that later. Or maybe that's something to research and like bring back to y'all the class. So we'll see about that. What else is he bringing up here that's of particular note? So he says the kings of Alada and Wida had made the mistake of either failing to protect their own citizens from enslavement or of actually conniving at their enslavement. The Dahomey never followed such a policy, which was directly antagonistic to the very maintenance of the state. Instead, the Dahomey eventually became the class rating state of West Africa after failing to get Europeans to accept any products other than human beings. To achieve that, the Dahomey had to first build up a tightly organized military state, whose monarch came much closer to an authoritarian or despot than the elephant of Oyo or the Asantehane of Asante. Secondly, the Dahomey invested a great deal of time and ingenuity on its army so as to protect its own citizens and wage war abroad. So, quite literally, the logic of colonialism and the logic of trying to enslave other human beings is giving way to like more brutality, more grotesque realities, more war, more rearing up of soldiers. And like you can see like the very early organizational roots in Africa organizing against the colonial structure. You know, he's quite literally talking about like this buildup and intentional mobilization against the colonial settler project and against occupation. So that's like a really important thing to bring up. This idea that like there was already the concept of the importance of organizing and mobilizing with intent against the state even back then. He said they go further to like make war elsewhere. What imaginably what the intent to resolve this colonial contradiction all over the fucking continent. So that's a super important thing to bring up. Doesn't seem to be anything else anybody else wants to add. So if there's not anything else anybody wants to add, we can end it here. But if anybody has any thoughts, now's the time to go ahead and share. Sounds good. So we're gonna wrap up. I know we usually go about 2 hours, but you know, I need to get going. I'm having some health issues, so I'm gonna go get that taken care of. But it was good reading with y'all. Thank y'all for being here. I look forward to continuing Angela Davis's woman racing class with y'all tomorrow, and Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality on Saturday. Until then, y'all comrades know I love y'all. Solidarity always, and I'll see y'all for the next reading.
We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.